November 1939. The British War Office signs off on a new piece of equipment, a new bayonet for the No. 4 rifle. It wouldn't reach the soldiers' hands in large numbers until 1941, but when it finally did, the reaction was universal. Absolute disbelief. Just look at the comparison. Germany was issuing its troops proper, high-quality fighting knives. The Americans began the war with elegant, long sword bayonets. And Britain? Britain handed its soldiers a crude steel rod. It had no edge, no point you could whittle with. It was just 8 inches of round spike. It couldn't cut a loaf of bread. It couldn't open a tin of rations. As a field tool, it was almost useless. The soldiers took one look at it and gave it a name: the pig sticker. They meant it as an insult. But what those soldiers didn't understand, what they couldn't see at the time, was that British engineers had deliberately built an ancient weapon for a modern war. And when the ammunition ran out, across the Mediterranean, through the heat of the North African theatres, that cold piece of steel would prove a terrifying point, that the psychology of the bayonet mattered far more than its shape. To understand why Britain decided to arm its soldiers with what looked like a medieval shank, you have to understand the sheer scale of the problem they faced in 1939. The country was preparing for total war against Germany, and to put it bluntly, the math didn't work. The Royal Small Arms Factory could produce rifles, it could manufacture machine guns, but what it could not do was simultaneously forge millions of the classic Pattern 1907 sword bayonets that had served in the Great War. Those old bayonets were magnificent. They featured 17-inch blades, but making them required skilled craftsmen. It required specialized grinding equipment. It required a manufacturing capacity that simply no longer existed. Every arsenal in Britain was already running at maximum output. Every skilled toolmaker was needed somewhere else. Something had to give. Think about what a proper knife bayonet demands. You need forging, grinding, heat treatment. The blade has to hold a razor edge. The handle needs careful fitting. The locking mechanism demands precision machining. Germany could manage this because their industrial base hadn't been disrupted yet. America could manage it because their factories weren't under threat of being bombed. Britain faced a different reality entirely. The Pattern 1907 had been a beast of a weapon in its day. With that 17-inch blade, plus the rifle, it gave a British soldier over 5 feet of reach. Staff officers loved that reach. They were terrified British troops would lose bayonet duels against the French or Germans if their reach was too short. But the Great War taught a brutal lesson. When you look at the medical breakdowns from World War I, bayonet wounds were actually a tiny fraction of casualties, often well under 1%. Sometimes they weren't even counted separately. They were just lumped in with miscellaneous accidents, alongside falls and equipment malfunctions. The weapon that training manuals devoted endless hours to, the weapon that transformed shy civilian recruits into screaming warriors, barely registered in the casualty statistics. In the cramped trenches, that long, elegant sword bayonet was actually a liability. It was too unwieldy. Soldiers preferred entrenching tools, improvised clubs, anything that gave them room to move. But the statistics told a lie, or at least only half the story. What the numbers couldn't capture was the psychological transformation. Recruits who had never harmed a fly learned to thrust steel into straw dummies while screaming at the top of their lungs. Mild-mannered clerks became aggressive fighters. The bayonet wasn't primarily a killing tool. It was a psychological conditioning device. It prepared men for the ugly reality of close combat. And that insight, that the mind matters more than the metal, shaped everything that followed. After 20 years of trials, testing folding bayonets, knife types, and cruciform blades, the British conclusion in 1939 was clear. They would adopt a spike bayonet, and they would prioritize one thing above all else: not combat effectiveness, not soldier preference, but manufacturing simplicity. The genius of the No. 4 Spike Bayonet lay not in what it could do, but in who could make it. The first production contract didn't go to a weapons manufacturer. It went to the Singer Manufacturing Company in Clydebank, Scotland, a company that made sewing machines. Singer had never made weapons before. They didn't need to. The design was so simple that textile machinery companies could produce it. Woolen machinery makers, cotton spinning specialists, even a company called Lewisham Engineering, which was founded in a bombed-out site in South London solely to make these spikes. Let's look at the weapon itself. It was roughly 10 inches long overall, with an 8-inch spike. It weighed about 220 grams, half the weight of the old sword bayonet. It was crude, and it got cruder. The first version, the Mark I, was actually quite nice. It had a beautifully machined cruciform spike with 4 flutes. But after 75,000 units, they realized it was too expensive. So came the Mark II. They eliminated the milling. It became just a simple, round spike. Over 3.3 million of these were made. Then, the Mark II Star. They stopped making it out of one piece and started welding the blade to the socket. You could actually see the stepped joint where the pieces met. And finally, the Mark III, the bottom of the barrel. A company called Joseph Lucas Limited, an automotive parts maker, stamped these out of 7 pieces of sheet steel and just welded them together. No attempt to smooth the joints. They just painted it black to cover the mess. It was little more than a screwdriver blade welded onto a lump of metal. But the strategy worked. By spreading production to sewing machine factories and auto shops, and even overseas to Canada and the US, Britain produced nearly 5 million of these things. Every single one looked the same. Every single one performed identically. When your manufacturing base is making sewing machines, you don't design for excellence. You design for consistency. So, we have a cheap, nasty metal spike. Now, let's see what happened when it met the enemy. Colonel Ronald Campbell, a legend at the British Bayonet School, stated it plainly. He said that even by 1914, the bayonet was technically obsolete as a killing tool. But he added that it was superb as a morale booster. Get the bayonet into the hands of despondent troops, he said, and you can make them tigers within hours. The training manuals from 1937 agreed. They explicitly stated that the threat of the bayonet will often cause the enemy to surrender. Note the phrasing, the threat. The goal wasn't to stab people. The goal was to make them run away before you even got there. And science backs this up. Humans have a primal, deep-seated aversion to being stabbed. We will stand and trade bullets at a distance, but the idea of cold steel entering the body triggers a fear response that gunpowder just doesn't. German troops were known to be particularly terrified of Allied units that had a reputation for using the bayonet. They feared the Canadians. They feared the Anzacs. They knew these men liked to get close. And nothing demonstrates this better than the Battle of 42nd Street in Crete, May 27, 1941. The Greek island of Crete. The New Zealand 28th Maori Battalion had been retreating for 7 days. They were exhausted. Ammunition was running dangerously low. German mountain troops, elite soldiers, blocked their escape route. The evacuation ships were waiting at the coast, but the Germans stood between the Allied forces and salvation. The situation looked hopeless. What happened next is the stuff of legend. According to the accounts, a Maori soldier picked up a Bren gun and began performing the Haka, the traditional war dance. The ancient chant echoed across the Mediterranean hillside. Other soldiers joined in. The roar grew louder. And then, they fixed those crude, pig-sticker bayonets. Battalion Commander Fred Baker recorded the scene. He wrote that his men didn't run. They walked. They walked straight toward the German positions. They jumped into the first line of German trenches. They bayoneted and clubbed everything in their path. Then they climbed out and walked to the next line. Baker said his men behaved as if they were on parade. The Germans, terrified by this wall of chanting men and cold steel, cracked. They ran. The charge drove the German forces back over 1,500 meters. When the dust settled, 121 German soldiers lay dead. Most had been bayoneted or clubbed. That single action, using weapons that cost pennies to make, facilitated the evacuation of over 16,000 Allied troops. This wasn't a fluke. The pattern held in North Africa. In June 1942, at Minka Kaim, the 2nd New Zealand Division was surrounded by Rommel's Afrika Korps. Again, the ammo was gone. The only way out was through the German lines. Lieutenant Karuwaka described the breakout. He said they went straight through Jerry's slit trenches. They left the chaos behind them, following the usual Maori roar. Captain Charles Upham earned his 2nd Victoria Cross during this breakout, one of only 3 people in history to win that award twice. Later, at El Alamein, Private Stanley Gurney charged 3 machine gun nests in a row. He killed the crews with his bayonet before he finally fell. Private Percy Gratwick took a German strongpoint with nothing but grenades and a bayonet. These weren't ceremonial weapons, they were tools of last resort. And when the mechanism of modern war jammed or ran dry, these crude spikes saved lives. But we have to be honest, the soldiers still hated them. Germany equipped its soldiers with the K98 bayonet, a solid 10-inch knife. It had a handle. You could use it to cut wire, open rations, whittle wood. It was a tool. The Americans, too, kept a knife-style blade, even when they shortened their bayonets. They understood that a soldier uses his knife for 100 daily tasks for every one time he uses it in combat. The British Spike could do none of this. Troops complained bitterly. Their most important daily task was opening tin cans of rations, and the pig sticker couldn't even do that. One collector described it perfectly. Little more than a screwdriver blade welded onto a boss. Yet, look at the photos. In wartime images, you rarely see American or German soldiers with bayonets fixed on their rifles, unless they're in immediate combat. But British troops? They are almost always pictured with those spikes mounted. Doctrine demanded it. The psychological effect, on both the man holding the rifle and the enemy looking at it, outweighed the fact that you couldn't use it to slice cheese. Now, there is a persistent myth about this weapon. You might have heard it. People claim that the Geneva Convention banned triangular or spike bayonets because the wounds they created couldn't be sutured or would never heal. This is false. No such prohibition exists in any international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 don't mention triangular bayonets at all. The British kept the number 4 spike in service until the 1960s. Do you really think they would have done that if it was a war crime? The medical claims are partially true, but exaggerated. Yes, a triangular puncture wound is harder to stitch up than a clean slice. But it's not impossible. Civil War doctors were sewing up bayonet wounds in the 1860s. The weapon was nasty, yes. It carried a high infection risk because it penetrated deep. But it wasn't illegal. When the war finally ended, Britain immediately admitted defeat on the design. They started working on the number 9 knife bayonet, which essentially said, "Okay, fine, we need a blade." They knew the soldiers hated the pig sticker. As one researcher noted, the troops couldn't get rid of it soon enough. And yet, it stayed. The number 4 rifle and its spike bayonet persisted in cadet forces into the 1980s. The sniper variant served into the 1990s. For decades, British soldiers trained with the same crude spike their grandfathers had carried at El Alamein. The number 4 spike bayonet represented a brutal, cold calculation. Britain needed millions of weapons. They didn't have the time or the skilled labor to make them pretty, so they made them available. The calculus was simple. A soldier without a bayonet is just a man with an empty rifle. But a soldier with a bayonet, even a crude spike that looks like junk, is something more. He is a threat at any range. He has a connection to centuries of military tradition. When the ammo ran out in Crete, when the Afrika Korps closed in, that useless piece of steel performed exactly as military psychology predicted. Fixed bayonets transformed desperate men into an attacking force. They made enemies flee rather than face the blade. The specific shape didn't matter. The German soldiers facing a British charge didn't stop to calculate the manufacturing cost of the steel coming toward them. They didn't care that it was made in a sewing machine factory. They saw death at arm's length. They saw men who had nothing left to lose. And that was the point. The crude spike that soldiers mocked worked, because bayonet combat was never really about the bayonet. It was about psychology. And psychology doesn't require a sharp edge. British engineering solved the problem not by building a better weapon, but by building the right weapon for the reality of total war. 5 million pig stickers armed the force that liberated Europe. The soldiers who carried them hated them. The Germans who faced them feared them. And that was the point all along.
Smash that like button and subscribe for more secrets like this. See you next time.